welcome to Why We Write. I'm your host, Randall Beyer. My guest today is Professor Elizabeth DAUMER of Eastern Michigan University's Department of English, Language, and Literature. Dr. DAUMER teaches poetry, composition, and literature at EMU, and is an essayist and scholar of the poets Muriel Rukeyser and T.S. Eliot. Her written work includes numerous essays on these two writers, including two works of digital scholarship, The Context for Water Lily Fire and Ajanta, an Introduction, both published in Muriel Rukeyser, A Living Archive. She's also the editor or co-editor of three works, a special edition of the Journal of Narrative Theory devoted to Muriel Rukeyser's writing, the international reception of T.S. Eliot, published by Continuum Press in 2007, and the Feminist Teacher Anthology, published by Teachers College Press of Columbia University in 1998. Professor DAUMER has published academic articles and reviews in such journals as the Journal of Narrative Theory, Pedagogies, an International Journal, English Literary History, and Comparative Literature Studies. Professor DAUMER, welcome to Why We Write. It's great to have you here.
Glad to be here.
You know, we talk about writing, why we write, why you write, and why we write as people. You write about poetry, about writing itself, and about women in writing. So that's my first question, to open up the show. Why do you write, and why do we write?
Why do I write? So I've been thinking about that, and these days my major reason for writing seems to be to explore something, to discover something. So I want to find out something. If I've already made up my mind about a topic, I don't feel like writing about it. So it's always, for instance, the essays on Rukeyser's poems, these contextual essays. They're essays that I feel like are necessary for people to understand her poetry. And so I do quite a bit of research to place them in a context that is important for understanding them. I do archival research and then write about that, so that's kind of fun. So I really think of the essay I write as an attempt to come to some insight, and so that's very strong, and that's where the joy and energy comes from. I go like, I don't really understand this, let me find out.
There are so many lines in poetry that you really do wonder about the context. With a novel, the context gets in some way explained to you, but poetry condenses things.
That's right. A novel creates a world, and then of course you can write about that world, but a poem is a voice speaking to you, and you go like, wow, what's going on?
Yeah,
you know,
yes, yeah.
What are they telling us? And it's very exciting to do that kind of work, I think. But there are lots of other reasons for writing. When I was a child, I wrote and I painted little notes to my mother. I think of them as love letters. They didn't belong. As a teenager, I wrote because I was confused and I wanted to understand things. And so I wrote these angry journal entries, angry letters to myself. So there are lots of reasons to write. As an academic, of course, you're supposed to write, which can be a terrible prison, I think, the academic essay, where you sort of perform that you know what you're talking about. Not very useful, I think, but if you're lucky, you develop your own set of motivations for writing.
Well, you mentioned as a child, that was actually question number 2 that I wanted to explore, because it's interesting to me what early experience leads to, you know, their career or what they do eventually when they become an adult. So do you remember these little notes and whatnot? Do you have early childhood memories of?
Well, I remember them because my mother kept them. You know, they were very meaningful for her, and so I remember though writing little things, and I remember as a child being very taken with songs, with singing, and with poetry. You know, I stuttered as a child, so poetry and singing both are genres where you don't stutter.
It's very true.
I mean, you just don't. So it's the musical aspect. So I loved that. But then in high school, I found writing, I became sort of alienated from those very specific essays you were supposed to write. And I didn't write as much any longer. And I had to find my way back to that. And so teaching poetry nowadays, I give my students writing ideas and practices. I always say, listen, I'm not a poet. I'm just a lover of poetry. But we can all write poetry. Nobody, it doesn't have to be good, we just have to do it. It's fun. And so then I write again. And I think that takes me back to those early experiences, which I don't remember well enough, except that my mother still has some of that stuff.
Of course, yes. I think maybe every mom has something from the early days.
And letters, that's right. You know, and at that time in school we were asked to keep journals when we went on trips, and so there were always little things with paintings on the side. And my mother was a big collector of all of our things.
Great memories. So you wrote something in your online blog, your scholarship blog, about, it was self-reflective about teaching, and I actually was going to lead into teaching eventually, but I can open it up now.
Yes.
About letting your opinion show, or in the nature of interpretation, students and yourself, you were reflecting on your own, have to come to an interpretation by maybe misunderstanding something. And you've already, as a teacher, kind of worked out your interpretation in a way, and you were being a little bit self-critical, saying, I have to hold back on that.
That's a real challenge. Yeah, that's a real challenge. So when you teach particular authors and you teach them again and again, like I love to teach T.S. Eliot, but I can become quite, I have made up my mind about certain aspects of him, and I don't find that fruitful in discussing the author's work with students. In part, it's because I'm not a lecturer, I don't really like to lecture very much. And so it's I think of interpretation as a sort of collective effort. And so I try to think of it this way, that my students allow me to have new ways of reading a poem. They come to it for the first time, and sometimes they help me see something that I haven't seen.
Might not have been there before.
That's
or
right.
New
That's
for you
right.
as well. Right.
So I try to enjoy that a little more and step back from my convictions about meaning, because it's not really about it, is it? Interpretation really is meaningful to the extent to which you come to an satisfying understanding, not your teacher. Well,
what brought you to these two particular poets, and do you see a common thread between them in some way, or?
That's really interesting, because.
And feel free to tell us something about the writing of both.
Yeah, so I will tell you about T.S. Eliot, because when I was a student in Germany, I had to write this big test, an essay on T.S. Eliot, and I failed it. And I found T.S. Eliot very difficult, and as a graduate student, I took a class just on Eliot, and I can't say that I was particularly taken with him. I was a feminist. I thought he was a misogynist and anti-Semite and too authoritarian. But I ended up writing my dissertation on him, which is still striking. But there was a moment, I did a feminist analysis. I just took his poetry apart. And I guess I felt the need to do that because he was still, at that time, such an authoritative figure. So I pushed him off his pedestal. But while I was writing my dissertation, I finally really read his poetry. And I read 4 quartets. And I just absolutely fell in love with it. It was really I went wow, I had no idea what a beautiful poet he is.
A completely different side based on your...
Completely, and I did, for the first time, I allowed myself to read him not as a feminist or as an academic, but just a woman reading a a poem, and four quartets, I still think of that as his greatest work, and I still reread it and I still love it, just as I did then. So that was really a great experience, and that gave me a lot of confidence in being able to talk about poetry, because when I was hired here, I was hired as a teacher of poetry. You know, I only had one class in poetry in my whole university education.
Up to the point where you wrote your dissertation and whatnot.
Because for some reason people didn't, there was a time people didn't teach poetry that much.
Right.
You know?
Well, must have been a great opportunity then.
Yes.
To explore both writing and teaching.
Yes. And so Rochheiser I came to completely on my own, really. Well, if you ever come to something completely on your own. There's this Rochheiser Reader was published, I read about it, I bought it, and I looked at the poems. I started teaching her. So with her it was very much what happened when I put a poem into a classroom. Things happened. She really made things happen in the classroom. So she has one poem, it's called Saint Roch, where she apologizes to roaches for treating them so badly and for not learning their language and for trying to annihilate them. It's just such a weird and powerful poem, and so students have very strong responses to it. And that got me interested in her ability to elicit that kind of, you know, visceral, because it's disgusting, a roach, huh?
Right, it really takes an effort to see it from the other side, I guess.
That's right, and she does that, you know.
Was that something that led to a kind of internal teaching moment where you thought, oh, this opposition that's so strong, I mean, people do have a revulsion to that, to roaches and what, it's an opportunity to explore something.
Yes, absolutely, you know, I mean, it gave me more courage into sort of putting something out there that I was a little worried sometimes as to how they would respond, you know, because the roach imagery, some students might identify with it. So an Arab American woman student first time around said, that's me, you know, I am that roach. Right. But it was not negative, you know, she felt empowered by it rather than, but you know, you don't know that.
That's true. And we'll come back to talk about that. We'll take a short break and be right back.
Pterosaurs are often called pterodactyls because of the structure of their wing. Pterodactyl, in fact, means wing finger, and the wing did indeed consist solely of a large finger. Pterosaurs was enormously large. The fin extended from the tip of this finger to either the side of the body or the hind limbs.
So now it's midterms, and you seem to be missing some steps between the evolution of winged mammals and the first shuttle? Easier said than done, you say? Well, for starters, try and get down the main points. Then if you have time, get down some examples. Abbreviate frequently used names. Make Martin Luther King. Oedipus Rex can be. Places. Abbreviate any frequently used words. You're also more likely to retain the material if you review your notes as soon as possible and recopy them so they're more legible, highlighting the high points.
You're an individualist, a person who can stand against all adversity.
But your grades suck.
Group study.
The best way to learn is to try and teach someone else. And when you study with someone else, you can compare notes and what will be on the test. You can use the quiz bowl method.
What's the airspeed velocity of a laden English swallow?
There's safety in numbers. If there's a problem you all have on a test, you can go to the professor as a group.
And always, try and study with people who are stronger students than yourself.
So we're back talking about Muriel Rukeyser's effect of a poem about roaches, and you were mentioning an Arab American student and students' reactions in general.
That's
about that.
Yes, and so they have very strong reactions, and what I've learned with her poems sometimes when I teach them without the title, for instance the poem that I sometimes give to them without the title, because once they see roach, they read it all in the context of Roch. And so without the title, it's just about I and you and we. And so I asked them, who do they think the I is and who the you is? And the best answer I got was once, the I is a village elder and the you is a divorced husband. He was compared. So very strong emotional reactions, you know, to being the outcast. So,
did you find a thread in your work between Eliot and Roch?
Strangely enough, I have, and I have pursued that more recently. First of all, Roch, who was, of course, you know, a generation younger, sought out T.S. Eliot in the 1930s when she went to Europe. There's no record of what actually happened. And certainly when she to poetry, he was the poetic authority. Right. But what interests me is that both of them do speak with a sort of public voice, even when they're very personal. And in the case of Eliot, he never wanted that public voice, but he was immediately interpreted as the voice of a generation. And so he sort of took that on, that voice of speaking to a culture. And then for quartets, of course, he spoke to Europe in World War II, and he offered, I think, understanding and consolation. So he had a powerful understanding of the public role of the poet. And for Roch, the personal and the public were always merged. But she being a woman, she got a lot of, you know, people didn't like that. They thought she was presumptuous. They said, how dare she be a female? You know, as if a woman could not be a, you know, could not be a Rochizer. But so she never separated poetry from other realms of life, and she never wanted to. Eliot wanted to, but he was never read that way. So he was more of a reluctant cultural voice, whereas she always was very clearly. So she's a real precursor to Adrienne Rich, I would say, and Rich learned a lot from her and has acknowledged that in various essays. And for a woman to speak, not just personally, but to speak publicly, that was unusual at her time, and I think it's still a little unusual today.
Do you try to explore that in the discovery that you talked about in the process of writing itself? It's to get back to the why we write. Is there something that you...
why we write, yes. Yeah, let me think of that. I write about different things with each, whatever sort of appeals to me, and it's very personal, actually, my choices. So with Eliot recently, I've been writing about gesture, about his gestural poetics. And so that's an interest that I came to through Rochizer, who always says that poetry, what I learned from both, you might say, is that poetry is not something we understand, but it's something we feel, and then we understand. So it goes through the body to the brain, not the other way around. And that I'm exploring with both poets. And I feel like their power has to do with that people have very strong visceral responses to them. And if they're allowed to have them. With Eliot, there's this whole, you know, this whole veil of academic exposition around him, which keeps us from having that visceral response. But when I teach him, for instance, the Wasteland, I teach it as a performative poem. You would like that. And they have to make it into a play. And so we just perform it. And I say to them, I don't even want to know what you think it means. I want us to perform it, and then you will know what it means, because you will feel what it means. And this might seem a little hocus pocus, but it's really true.
But it happens through the performance, no doubt.
Yes, yes.
Getting up and
that's right, because as soon as you perform it, you have to do it in a certain
and
way.
There's another, I'm thinking meaning, but it's through either the movement or the body or thinking that it's a different form of knowledge that you wouldn't experience unless you engage in it that way.
That's right, and then you can reflect on that experience, and then your scholarship can come from that. So more and more I'm looking at the sort of somatic aspect of their poetics, and that does interest me a great deal. And I don't always write about it. So right now I'm in the process of trying to come up with new frameworks that allow me to do that, and I have to be more interdisciplinary. I have to talk with people who know something about performance, for instance, or dance, or just arts that involve the body.
That's really interesting. It's really interdisciplinary to get another point of view. But
That's
I know
right.
that experiments with singing do the same thing.
Yes.
You can't understand the words unless you really sing them.
Yes.
And
yes.
then that poetic aspect of it, it's like the song brings out almost a much fuller understanding.
A much fuller understanding, which is why poems live, I always say they live on the page, but they also really live off the page.
Yeah, yeah.
And the way they live off the page is often much more interesting to me than the way they live on the page. So
Yeah, and poetry and song are
That's right.
originated together, so.
my students out when I say
You
to them, sing it. You will understand the form of the poem immediately if you sing it. And so sometimes they do.
Mm-hmm. Tell me a bit about the gesture. I
Yes.
didn't stop you because I
No,
wanted you to
yes, yeah.
express yourself, but gestural, you were looking to understand the gesture in poetry.
Well, what I found with Eliot, for instance, he has this wonderful poem, which name, I have forgotten the title, but there is this famous line in it, some infinitely gentle, infinitely suffering thing. So I think it's nocturnes, where each one, it's either the or something. So it's a poem filled with hands and feet, and the hands do things and the feet do things. And I've been reading it, and when it gets to this moment, some infinitely gentle, infinitely suffering thing, I always know that I do this kind of gesture. So I thought to myself, I bet I'm not the only one, because it is, when you get to that infinitely gentle, infinitely suffering, you want to protect it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And at an Eliot conference, I did a sort of experiment. I said, I'd like you to listen to this poem, close your eyes, and at this point, I want you to show me through a gesture what you think is going on. And really, a lot of them really used their hands. He had set it up for us to use our hands because the hands were so much part of the poem.
Mm-hmm.
But there, the gesture was not performed by the poem, but it was elicited in the reader, and that interests me in terms of empathy and how we understand somebody else. Often I think we imitate them gesturally, and then we understand. So I'm interested in that relationship between embodiment and understanding. I'm not a scientist about it, so it's a little,
There's so much fascinating stuff about gesture, how we, I guess, humans in ways of finding some ground between each other, oftentimes one will change the position
right.
and the other will
That's right.
mimic it,
Yes.
completely unconsciously.
Completely
Yeah,
unconsciously,
yeah.
which is why, we give each other these cues, even facially,
Yeah.
and some people don't, and it's disturbing.
Yeah, right.
If they
Yeah.
stay completely. So there are a lot of things going on in terms of body and space and gesture, and of course Eliot has a lot of poems where he points, or where people sort of gesture but not quite, where gestures are sort of always partial. So it's, I think it's a very promising direction. I just have to have time to pursue it more. So this is my thing about
much,
writing.
right.
Writing takes a lot of time.
It does indeed.
It's a slow process.
This is something I guess
Yes.
all of us have to know. I'm always encouraged when people who I admire for their ability to write and seem to produce enormous amounts say that writing is a process, editing is a process of
Yes.
that. It just doesn't come out of you and it's ready to go. You have to
No.
work it through. And actually, I had a question
Yes.
about that because we're talking now about writing itself.
Yes.
It's a great
Yes.
segue. Do you find yourself at times disembodied in a certain way? You're thinking about writing,
Yes.
and yet you're writing creative scholarship about a topic, but then you maybe look at yourself as a critic in a way.
Yes. You know, I struggled with that for a while because, for instance, when I teach classes on poetry, students will always ask me if I'm a poet. And when I say, no, I'm not a poet, they seem disturbed. It's different from fiction. People don't expect you to write fiction in fiction classes. But in poetry classes, there really is that expectation.
Yeah.
And I will say, I write poems sometimes, and I do. And I write poems with them. But I say, you know, reading other people's work closely is really a form, it's a very creative engagement and attentive engagement with somebody else's work. And I try to get them to see how the essay about somebody else's writing, and of course I try to remember that myself, is a creative enterprise. It's not just dry, you know, dry or you're sort of feeding on the creative energy of somebody else, even though critics have often been presented that way, you know.
Yeah, that's right.
But that is really a way of being attentive to somebody else's work and understanding them. And then your own writing, of course, a good essay interweaves my words with the words of the author, and it sort of changes as a result of that. You know? So I try to talk about that. I'm getting more interested in the essay as a form, you know, that could. So for my senior students this time, I said, write a critical essay that goes beyond the bounds of criticism that you've learned. Try to take it somewhere new. And some of them have, some of them do. But many of them have been so schooled in this particular kind of writing that they find it hard to break out of.
It's a lot to take on.
Yes, it's a lot to take on.
Well, I want to thank you very much for being with us, and I want to tell the audience that we've been talking with Professor Elizabeth DAUMER of the English department at Eastern Michigan University. For another edition of Why We Write, I want to thank all of you for being with me, and can see us next time.